Hi, Steve.
Hey, Bob.
How are you?
I'm very good. And you?
I'm excellent. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Steven Nadler, a professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin,
Yes, right.
and something of a Spinoza scholar. In fact, what drew our attention to you is a piece you recently wrote for, is it Eon magazine?
Yes.
So Aeon is pronounced the same way as Eon, and they are the same thing. Is that true?
I assume so. Yes.
Okay. It's an interesting magazine. I only discovered it recently. I assume it's online only, but they do these kinds of, accessible but scholarly things. It's pretty highbrow as the internet goes.
It is, and it covers a lot of ground. I mean, philosophy is only one of the domains. There's science, there's art, there's culture, literature.
Hmm.
It's a very impressive online publication.
It is. It is. And the piece was Why Spinoza Still Matters. This being the philosopher Spinoza, who many people may have heard of. And the subtitle was At a Time of Religious Zealotry, Spinoza's fearless defense of intellectual freedom is more timely than ever. So I want to talk mainly about that, about what you think Spinoza has to offer us at this moment in history. But I wanted to start by talking about the fact that he is, I guess, in a kind of official sense, a heretic. The centuries after he lived, he remains kind of a heretic. And you played a little bit of a role in maybe trying to get that designation changed, or at least in weighing in on the question of whether the designation should be changed.
Yeah, the latter is probably a better
Right,
description of
right.
what we were doing. Of course, it was up to the rabbi and the board of directors of the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community to decide whether the cherem or ban should be lifted.
Right.
Didn't ask the four of us, the members of this advisory committee, to weigh in directly on that question.
Mm-hmm.
They were using us for was to get background information on who Spinoza was, what his philosophy was, and the historical, political, religious, and intellectual circumstances of the ban.
Mm-hmm.
And then they asked us what, in our opinion, would be the advantages and disadvantages of lifting the ban, and we weighed in on that. And I think they could tell from each of our reports what we thought would be the thing to do.
Mm-hmm. I'm
But
guessing you're anti-ban in your heart.
I'm absolutely anti-ban in my heart. And in a New York Times editorial about a year ago on just this issue, I'm tried to make it perfectly clear that I am 100%, 110% against people being banned for the expression of ideas,
Mm-hmm.
for any intellectual matters whatsoever. Unfortunately, when you write a piece for the Times, the last thing you should do is read the comments section because you can get skewered by people who misinterpret what you're saying.
Yeah.
So yes, I am against banning people, although I do recognize that the tool of banning somebody is something that's used
Yeah.
by religious groups and
Well,
others.
and in a certain sense, I mean, maybe we should talk about this a little, about whether it kind of almost a community that defines itself by belief, it's not surprising that there would be bounds. But why don't we talk a little about the original kind of his original expulsion from the community or whatever. So this is in 1656. He was 23, and I want to quote from your pieces, quoting from the finding itself of the Jewish congregation in Amsterdam. They cited abominable heresies and monstrous deeds. Those are quotes, and they hereby quote, expel, excommunicate, curse, and damn Baruch de Spinoza. And then they say he is to be, quote, cast out from all the tribes of Israel, and his name is to be, quote, blotted out from under heaven. Now, you could have excused him for thinking when he heard that, was it something I said? But the truth is, we don't know, right? We don't know what he said because he hadn't, at that point, there was no body of writing and they didn't get very specific.
Yeah, that's right. And there's two schools of thought generally about what actually happened, what his offense was. One school of thought focuses more on his deeds, because that is one of the things that's cited in the Cherem document. And so a scholar has suggested, in a very interesting way, that his transgressions were of a financial and business matter, that he went to the Dutch authorities in such a way that he was able to relieve himself of debts from within the Jewish community. And the Portuguese Jewish community of 17th century Amsterdam had a rule that explicitly says all such disputes of a financial matter are to be resolved within the community.
Mm-hmm.
So by going to the Dutch authorities to have himself declared an orphan and therefore relieved of debts he inherited from his father's business, that was a direct violation of the community's laws. And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at it, but I don't think it does justice to the vitriol of that document. It's a really unprecedented harem document for the time.
Yeah, and it does cite not just monstrous deeds, which what you just described could qualify as, I guess, but it cites abominable heresies.
Yeah.
A heresy is a heresy.
And I think we should take the document at its word on that he was saying, he hadn't written anything, as you said, but he was being drawn out in conversations and saying things that I suspect no 17th century rabbi, and especially in a community that was really still kind of reintegrating itself into normative Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And the leaders of the community resorted to the ban much more frequently than other communities in Europe at the time. And so they saw what Spinoza was saying as a threat. And if you look at his published philosophical works, which he began writing within just a few years of the ban, you get a fairly good sense of the kinds of things he was probably saying at the time.
Yeah, although I imagine he felt more liberated to say them after, any reluctance he would have had to say things like that was presumably vanished once he was expelled from the community. In any event, there is at least one 21st century rabbi who continues to believe that his opinions should exclude him from the community, right? Because in the end, the ban was not lifted after you gave your testimony, right?
That's right. The present chief rabbi of the Amsterdam Sephardic community, decided that it would be inappropriate and beyond his authority to lift the ban. I think he's entirely right. First of all, the ban has to be lifted only by the community that issued it in the first place. So only the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community can lift the ban. So all these calls you hear over the course of the 20th century by David Ben-Gurion and others, we lift the ban. There's no authorization for that. Mm-hmm. And the present rabbi in Amsterdam said, am I that much wiser than my 17th century colleagues? They knew Spinoza. They knew exactly what was going on. Moreover, Spinoza knew the rules of the game. So who am I to overrule my historical colleagues? Moreover, the notion of lifting a cherem against somebody who's been dead for over 300 years doesn't really make much sense, because in Judaism, a cherem is a kind of social, liturgical, and economic ostracism of a person in their lifetime. The point of lifting it when the person is dead really doesn't make much sense. And besides, Spinoza himself would say, I couldn't care less. Do whatever you want. I'm gone.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it wasn't, the rabbi wasn't considering the question of, well, do Spinoza's not terribly theistic philosophical pronouncements comply with modern theology, which might have been one way to approach it. And of course, if it had been like a reform congregation, I think he'd probably be okay on those lines, although this was an Orthodox congregation, right? Today,
right.
It still is. It is an Orthodox.
Yeah. Rabbi said, look, I'm all for freedom of thought, but there is not freedom of thought and expression within Orthodox Judaism. And the kinds of things, as we understand it, the kinds of things that Spinoza was saying both to his peers in the community and then later in his philosophical writings, these are not the kinds of things, according to this rabbi, these are not the kinds of things that an Orthodox Jewish community can tolerate.
Yeah.
It would be wonderful if Judaism, even Orthodox Judaism, permitted freedom of thought. As I said, I am against banning people, and I disagree with this rabbi.
Although, if it's a religious community, I mean, Christian communities have beliefs. And if you don't, you are not a Southern Baptist if you don't believe Jesus died for your sins. And that makes sense to me. I mean, that's... So I guess I'm coming out in support of the ban of Spinoza, which I never imagined myself doing. But what I'm really saying is just this is the way communities of belief operate. And as it happens, there are now communities of very liberal theological belief in both Christianity and Judaism. But even now, Orthodox Judaism is not particularly liberal. But in any event, it sounds like the rabbi was really not even thinking about it in those terms anyway. He wasn't asking, is he acceptable in terms of modern belief?
Well, in a way, he was. He said, look, I recognize that today the kinds of things that Spinoza is saying are fairly commonplace outside Orthodox Judaism. But we are not outside Orthodox Judaism. We are a certain orthopraxic community. And these are not the kinds of things that we can tolerate. I mean, as you said, every club has its rules. And I guess if you want to be in the club, you have to play by the rules. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing, though, is that Spinoza did not see himself as trying to reform Judaism. He recognized that Judaism is constituted by its laws and the observance of those laws. What he was out to reform was not Judaism, but rather society itself, and to try to liberate society from the kind of control that Orthodox religious and ecclesiastic individuals were trying to impose on society.
Okay, so that is one aspect of his thought that you emphasize, his commitment to what we would call today, I guess, liberal values or something, freedom of expression and so on. We don't know that that's what got him into trouble per se. I mean, there are also his ideas about God and theology, which would have been controversial to say the least.
Yeah.
And I guess we should talk about both of those. Why don't we start out by mentioning an issue you raise about how Spinoza, unlike many philosophers, including some of his era, has a following today, right? It's there, and I didn't quite realize this, but talk about that a little. He continues to, I guess, inspire people.
It's really quite remarkable. I mean, you don't see people going around proclaiming themselves to be Cartesians, followers of Descartes, or Leibnizians. But Spinoza really does seem to have struck a nerve in modern culture, and well, not just today, but throughout the 19th and 20th century, and especially in the Jewish world. Spinoza is a hero to so many different movements or groups. Spinoza is kind of a Rorschach test. I think people see in Spinoza what they want to see. So he's been regarded as a mystic, as a defender of rabbinic Judaism, as a socialist, a Buddhist, as an anarchist, as a free thinker, as a libertine, as a Republican, as a Democrat. So people see in Spinoza a reflection of their own values. Mm-hmm. But it is quite remarkable that the way in which Spinoza has become really a paragon in modern culture, not just among philosophers, but novels, plays, operas, even works of visual arts are all dedicated to or inspired by Spinoza. And I was once in a museum in the Netherlands, and there was a sand sculpture on the floor, and embedded in this colorful sand sculpture were pages from Spinoza's Ethics.
And are there like groups of people who meet regularly and talk about Spinoza or profess their allegiance to him or something? I mean, are there actual? Is it a little bit like a modern day religion, or?
Religion might be a little bit too strong, but yeah, there are reading groups, there are Spinoza clubs, mm-hmm. And they're usually made up of non-academics who want to know more about Spinoza. So I think part of it is that there's a mystique about Spinoza. He was a rebel, and he was banned by the religious authorities, and that already gives somebody a certain kind of cachet mm-hmm. To the modern mind. But also the mystery of why he was banned adds something to the interest. But then as well, the kinds of things he was saying resonate so strongly with the modern liberal, secular, tolerant way of thinking. Mm-hmm. I think in this respect, it's often a parallel is often drawn between the banning of Spinoza and the punishment of Galileo. But I think there's a really important difference. Galileo's punishment was thoroughly misguided in the sense that the kinds of things that Galileo was saying, while they were perceived by the authorities of the Catholic Church to be inconsistent with Catholic dogma, they were scientific claims. Mm-hmm. And what they were really inconsistent with were philosophical and theological explanations of Catholic dogma. But Galileo never directly attacked any Catholic dogma. Mm-hmm. Spinoza directly attacks central tenets of rabbinic Judaism.
Okay. Now, one thing you didn't mention is something that I would have thought would be part of his appeal, which is that, he's thought of as a pantheist. You raised the question of whether he should really be thought of as an atheist, but he's thought of as a pantheist, which means, by conventional reckoning, that he did continue to use the word God and in some sense take it seriously. A pantheist is someone who identifies God with nature, with the universe. So I would have thought that maybe some of the appeal, including within Jewish congregations, is this idea that he has just a very liberal theology that is well suited to a modern world. You can be a thoroughgoing naturalist and continue to use the word God and continue to see the divine in things and yet have a totally scientific outlook. Is that some of his appeal or not?
I suppose so. I mean, for those who are attracted to Spinoza for that reason and do see him as a pantheist, like I say, people see in him what they want to. And if you are pantheistically minded, or if you think that there's something divine about nature, and that nature is deserving of worshipful awe, or it's the object of a religious experience or some kind of reverence, then Spinoza is your man. I actually think of Spinoza not as the pantheist. I mean, I do have trouble figuring out what exactly pantheism is. But
Me too.
As far as I can tell, the pantheist and the atheist agree that all there is nature. And so if we're talking about the metaphysics of theology, the pantheist and the atheist are in agreement. All there is nature. There is no supernatural beings. There is no transcendent reality. And so as far as I can tell, the only difference between pantheism and atheism is that the pantheist believes that there is something divine about nature, that nature is the object of worshipful awe or religious reverence, and is deserving of, is the object of a sort of religious or transcendental attitude. Mm-hmm. The atheist, like Spinoza, and this is why I think Spinoza is an atheist, the atheist says, well, it's not that we're making nature divine, but that we are reducing the divine to nature. And Spinoza, were Spinoza a pantheist, he would have, I think, an open attitude towards regarding nature as worthy of worshipful awe and religious reverence. But in fact, Spinoza rejects religious and worshipful awe as appropriate towards nature. The proper attitude to take towards nature is understanding, knowledge, and intellectual insight, not reverence or worshipful awe.
But so, does he not explicitly equate God with nature?
He does, but I think the move he's making there is not to say that there's something divine about nature, but rather he's trying to, I think it's a rhetorical move. He's trying to draw in his audience. Look, you guys think that there's God. Well, let me show you that if you believe that God is defined in such a way, come with me and I'll show you that what you really must believe then is that God is identical with nature and that really all there is nature.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always thought that pantheism to me sounds kind of just like relabeling the universe with the word God, which you can do if you want, but it seems to me that in the course of redefining the word God that way, you've kind of abandoned all the stuff about the concept of God that attracted people to the idea of God, right? I mean, if you look at religious believers and the reasons they might find it reassuring or inspiring or whatever to think of there being a God, it's like you pretty much lose all of those properties once you define God as being nothing more than nature. But maybe people see more in it than I'm seeing.
Well, unless you're a pantheist and you think that by identifying God with nature, you're elevating nature into some kind of providential force. And so God is not a transcendent anthropomorphic deity, but that nature itself exercises the same kind of providential role that God does in the Abrahamic religions. And we think of what, for example, the ancient Stoics often thought about nature, that nature does exercise a kind of providential or teleological.
Okay, I was going to ask if you meant teleological. So you're saying maybe nature has a purpose.
Yes.
Not providential in the sense that it looks out for individual people. I mean, sometimes something good might happen to you, and you might say, "How providential," but you don't mean that so much. I mean, in any kind of scientific reckoning of nature, bad stuff happens to individuals, and nature is not looking out for individuals. But there may still be some larger purpose unfolding.
And it may be looking out for human beings. I mean, to say that nature is providential doesn't imply that it's always going to be the best for me. I mean, this is the mistake that Leibniz's critics always make, that Voltaire reads Leibniz, who says it's the best of all possible worlds. The mistaken reading of that is that everything's going to work out for the best for you and for me and for everybody. Mm-hmm. But that's not what Leibniz means. Leibniz explicitly says that in the best of all possible worlds, sometimes even virtuous people will suffer. But to say that nature is divine, I think there is a meaningful way in which you could see, if you were a pantheist, see nature as providential, that there are purposes, that it is teleological, but also that it's looking out perhaps for human beings and their welfare. Or at the very least, that there are values in nature, that there's something good about nature. And that's also something that Spinoza explicitly rejects. In nature, whatever is, just is, period. There are no intrinsic values in nature. Things are good or bad only insofar as they contribute to or inhibit the well-being of individuals.
It could also be looking out for just life, or for life with certain properties like intelligence. In other words, it could be that, well, humans weren't in the cards, so to speak, but natural selection is a process that does tend to create pretty smart things, and there's a kind of power behind it and an inventiveness, and things flourish, and that's the general idea. And things may not work out well for any given individual or even any given species, but the system tends to persist. You could view it that broadly too.
I suppose, although that even to go that far seems to violate Darwinian natural selection, to say that it's moving in the direction of a good direction, kind of a Whiggish direction.
Oh, I don't think so, really. I mean, Darwin himself actually was willing to talk that way, I think, although it's unclear whether he was just trying to keep some clergy on his side, or I mean, he definitely did not believe in. He was not a theist. He didn't believe in God, and the cruelty of nature was what he cited. So he didn't believe in anything like a conventional God, but I don't think he ruled out the possibility that just natural selection by its nature does tend to create beings, and in many lineages there will be growth in complexity and intelligence. I'm not saying he attributed purpose to it explicitly, but I'm saying I don't think his view of the way natural selection works is incompatible with that kind of conception.
No, it tends towards fitness.
Tends toward fitness, for sure, by definition, yeah. But even you can accept that and still argue about how likely the growth of complexity and various other things were. Okay, so But anyway, Spinoza was not attributing purpose to nature, right?
Absolutely not. In fact, one of the most important lessons of the first part of the Ethics is that it's a gross mistake to think that nature acts in teleological or purposive ways, in the ways in which human beings act. Mm-hmm. And that is to anthropomorphize nature, to anthropomorphize God. Uh-huh. And that gives rise to the belief that nature has not just ends and purposes, but that nature has a plan for us and will stand in judgment over us according to how well we do or do not fulfill that plan. And that gives rise, in turn, to fear, a life governed by the passions of hope and fear. Hope that we will earn the eternal reward, and fear that we might be subject to eternal punishment. And that leads us to submit ourselves to the authority of manipulative ecclesiastics. And there lies the road to superstition and what he calls bondage.
And if he was saying that kind of thing, that might not have endeared him to ecclesiastical authorities.
That's right, because he was seeking straight out to undermine their influence, not just over the political system, but over the individual lives of citizens. One of the debates in the Netherlands in the 1660s was how much control the Dutch Reformed Church would have over such everyday things as moral behavior and observance of the Sabbath. And this is to try to control people's lives in a way that Spinoza thought was not just unjustified from a political and social point of view, but that violated people's freedom and autonomy. Because what human beings are naturally striving for is to be autonomous, free beings. That is, people whose actions follow from what they know and not from their passionate emotions, not how they're affected by other things.
Okay. And so I guess all of this is somewhat relevant to your contending in this piece in Eon that he's kind of the man of the hour, or at least somebody who has a lot to offer in the current context, right?
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at the ways in which our elections in this country, and we'll put aside for the moment what's happening in Europe and the Middle East. If you just look at the political waters of our country now, the ways in which religion has, I would say, infected the political process and has made it impossible for certain candidates to, in a way, be honest about what they do or do not believe. Could you imagine someone being elected president who either refused to swear the oath on the Bible, or who refused to say God bless America, or who explicitly said, I'm an atheist? The closest thing we got was Bernie Sanders, who really came close, but was not quite.
Yeah. Although at the same time, Donald Trump, I wouldn't have thought that you could say, I don't ask God for forgiveness, claim to be a Christian and then say, I don't ask God for forgiveness and get anywhere. I wouldn't have thought, certainly 10, 20 years ago, I would have thought that would have excluded you. And I mean, more broadly, on the subject of Trump, when I was reading in your piece what you just said about Spinoza, his concern that ecclesiastical authorities could manipulate people's emotions and bring out the worst in them, I thought, well, ecclesiastical authorities are not the only people who can manipulate people's emotions. And in fact, if you look at some of the most alarming, well, by my lights and maybe by yours, some of the alarming things going on in the world now, it's more secular demagoguery. It is the manipulation of people's emotions. I'm talking about, bigotry and racism and a kind of unreflective nativism and so on. By and large, many of the people doing it are not very religious. They're not putting it in very religious terms. And in any event, this manipulation of emotions does not depend on religious belief, right?
No, absolutely not. And at the same time, I'd also say that a lot of good and virtuous behavior is inspired by religious principles. It's not that religion, I don't believe that religion is necessarily a pernicious thing, although I do think the way it's mishandled by demagogues, both political demagogues and religious demagogues, that is what's pernicious. You watch these Sunday morning preachers on television. There's something to be really strange and scary about the thousands of people who show up for these things and just give gobs of money. They are being manipulated in a way that's frightening.
Yeah, how scary I find it depends on what exactly the message is. I mean, when it's the prosperity gospel, like I guess Joel Osteen qualifies. Are you like a connoisseur of these guys? Do you watch Joel Osteen? Do you know what I mean?
If I happen to turn on the TV and there he is, it's kind of...
It's engrossing.
It is.
It's engrossing because he's got it down to such an art and science.
Yeah.
And
he's a little scary with that smile of his, though. That's what...
Well, he's got some serious teeth there. Yeah. But that's not as alarming as some, I mean, that's kind of straightforward prosperity gospel. That doesn't, I find that fascinating. It doesn't scare me as much as some of the political, messages you hear from people. Yeah. But anyway, you're right about all,
But at the same time, I'm a fan of religion in a certain sense. I think to the extent to which it gives people a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose. If it veers too far into superstition, if your sense of belonging is grounded in superstitious beliefs, I find that problematic. But just to speak from my own experience, I was raised in a Jewish household, and I don't have a worshipful bone in my body. I'm an atheist, but my Judaism gives me a sense of belonging to a certain historical narrative, to a certain community. And I wouldn't say it necessarily gives my life its meaning, but it does provide some sense of meaning to my life. And it gives me it allows me to see a certain place for myself in history and in the world.
Although Jewish identity is kind of distinctive in that ability to kind of separate the kind of good parts of religion from explicit belief. You know what I mean? I mean, in Christianity, you can't be an atheist and declare it and remain part of many Christian congregations unless you want to call Unitarians Christian. And so you're kind of like lucky you can do that in a certain sense.
Yeah. And the food's great.
And plus, not to mention, yes, I was going to bring that up. I was just going to say my own litmus test. I don't mind supernatural beliefs so much as long as people are good people. I don't care what inspires them. I mean, for me, it's all an ethical question. It's like if these beliefs make you a good person, there are too many other things that need doing in the world for me to try to pry you away from these beliefs that, as far as I can tell, are actually having a good effect,
Well, that's a very Spinozistic attitude. Spinoza realized that not everybody is going to be able to read the ethics and be led to virtuous behavior through the intellect. And so in the Theological Political Treatise, you see an alternative route to virtue and justice and charity, where he says that what makes the Bible divine is not that it was composed by this supernatural lawgiver, but rather that it is a book that is especially good at inspiring people to treat other human beings with justice and charity. It's a morally edifying work. Now, of course, it's just a work of human literature, and any work of human literature that has that morally edifying effect is divine in the same sense in which Scripture is divine. It's just that Scripture is, the Bible is especially good at doing that. And he says, the beliefs that are proclaimed by the Bible they're not true, but they have that morally edifying effect, and great. If that's what moves people to justice and charity, that's how most people are going to be treating their fellow human beings.
So he's defining the divine in ethical terms.
Absolutely, yes.
I like that. I'll sign on to his. I'll become a Spinoza groupie, I guess.
It is a little. He does say that this moral message that you should treat other human beings with justice and charity, love God and love your fellow human beings. He says that is the unambiguous and consistent message of both Hebrew Scripture and the Christian Gospels. That seems a little far-fetched to me, especially to say that the consistent and unambiguous message of Hebrew Scripture is a God who acts with justice and charity.
You definitely want to skip some parts of Deuteronomy if you're going to preserve that belief.
Yep. And Judges, and it's a difficult thing to sustain.
For that matter, there are parts of the New Testament that are not emphasized by Christians, that don't mesh well with the idea of universal love. But I'm wondering, was he aware of, and did he refer to Philo of Alexandria at all, Spinoza?
He never refers to Philo of Alexandria. I can't recall whether he owned a copy of any of Philo's works. But I do think that the kind of mysticism that you find in Philo, even though Spinoza is often described as a mystic, I think that's wrong. I think he's as arch a rationalist as you can have, and that there's really not much that he would find sympathetic in Philo's sort of non-rational mysticism.
The reason Philo came to mind, and Philo, for people who don't know, Philo of Alexandria lived around the time of Jesus. He was a Jewish philosopher and I guess theologian, living in, I guess, Egypt. And he addressed this issue of like the bad parts of the Bible head on, and would like turn the seemingly bad parts into allegory. And he had this whole method of reconciling. So he said, well, the part about like drowning all these Egyptians that's actually a metaphor for this and that. And so he had a way of addressing the kind of what you might call the moral ambiguity of the Bible systematically. And And I would say he had, by the lights of that day, actually a pretty modern theology, but he was ultimately, I think, a theist by most readings. So you wouldn't expect Spinoza. He certainly saw history as purposive, as divinely imparted with a telos. So you wouldn't expect Spinoza to sign on. On the other hand, for somebody who lived 1,600 years before Spinoza, as people of that era went, I would think that he was closer to Spinoza's wavelength.
Well, and Philo, in his essay on providence, does imbue nature or the cosmos with a kind of beneficent teleology, that everything is for the best, and offers us a kind of classic theodicy about why bad things happen to good people and good things to bad people. And I think Spinoza thought that kind of exercise is a waste of time.
Is there a short version of Philo's explanation of why bad things happen to good people?
Well, part of it, it's a sort of complicated account. Part of it has to do with the fact that nature's laws are general and don't take into account the particular needs of individuals. And a lot of it as well has to do with the idea that the things that we think are evils are not really evils. That the true good is the good of the soul. So even if one suffers in one's material life, it doesn't mean that one is being punished.
Okay. So let's get to this mysticism issue a little. Why do you think, for Philo's part, I'm curious as to why you think Spinoza wasn't a mystic. For Philo's part, as I recall, he talks about times when he was carried up into kind of mystical rapture. I think periods of his life when he was kind of very disciplined and distance from the affairs of the world, and he talks about the effect that this had on his mind, and I don't forget the exact terms, but I think that would be considered kind of a mystical experience through, maybe even through contemplative discipline. I don't know, but you for one thing, you can step in and correct me if that's all wrong, but I'm also curious as to why is Spinoza considered a mystic, A, and B, why do you think it's wrong?
Usually when people call Spinoza mystic, they focus on two features of the ethics. One is his distinction between the three kinds of knowledge. The first kind of knowledge is imagination and sensory experience. The second he calls reason, which is sort of a classical inferential processes whereby you subsume individual things or events under general laws and explain them that way. But the third kind of knowledge he calls intuition. And his use of the word intuition seems to some people to suggest a kind of mystical, non-rational insight. But in fact, I think all he means by intuition is exactly what Descartes meant by intuition. Descartes was Spinoza's philosophical mentor in many ways. And what he means is that eventually you really come to know the essence of a thing, not by some non or irrational insight, but because you have so close, your intellect has so clearly perceived the way in which something relates to nature itself, its laws. The other grounds for thinking of him as a mystic come out of part 5 of the Ethics, where Spinoza turns to the intellectual love of God, which a classic set of concepts that you find throughout medieval Jewish and Christian and Arabic philosophy. And it can seem like a kind of mystical relationship with the divine. But in Spinoza's case, the intellectual love of God is a cognitive state, and it's a feature of the intellect, of the understanding. It's not some kind of a super rational or mystical insight.
So it's not, mystical insights are often thought of and sometimes defined as being ineffable, impossible to express in words. That would not apply to Philo's?
You mean Spinoza?
I'm sorry, Spinoza's. Yeah.
I think that's right. It would not apply to Spinoza's. I think Spinoza is far from the ineffable. And by mysticism, in this case, all I'm really referring to is mysticism as a form of epistemology, as an account of how we come to know certain things. And for Spinoza, the highest form of knowledge is an intellectual understanding.
Okay.
It doesn't go beyond our natural rational faculties.
So you're seeing mysticism as a non-rational form of enlightenment, and you're saying Spinoza wouldn't put up with that.
Right. It's a kind of illumination that transcends our natural faculties and comes from another source.
But did he ever give like rapturous accounts of contemplation of nature or anything like that?
Nope.
Nope.
No rapture in Spinoza.
No rapture. Well, and
No.
then it does seem a little odd that he's thought of as a mystic, although,
Well, like I say, people see in Spinoza what they want to see.
yeah.
And he gives them material for doing so. When you start talking about at the end of the Ethics, when he starts talking about the blessedness and salvation and the intellectual love of God, it looks like Spinoza has really now gone back to a kind of religiosity. But what he's really doing is taking these standard theological and religious concepts and terms and showing you that they can be given a rational Spinozistic spin.
Spin, okay. Now, one thing you say here is that, attributing this view to Spinoza, the more one knows about nature and especially about oneself as a human being, the more one is able to avoid the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to navigate the obstacles to happiness and well-being that a person living in nature necessarily faces. The result of such wisdom is peace of mind, and so on. Did he go into much detail about this, about how this works? I mean, it sounds very appealing.
He did. When you see that not just our bodies, like all bodies, are subject to the laws of nature, but also our mental life, our emotions and passions and thoughts and ideas, our beliefs and even our evaluations of things are subject to deterministic laws. It's a very stoic lesson that Spinoza draws from that our emotions about the arrival of things we value and their loss will be weakened when we come to see that we have very little control over how things in nature are governed.
Yeah. Okay.
Very much like the lesson of Epictetus,
right.
or Seneca.
Right. But he didn't have a kind of a what you could call a spiritual discipline or anything that helped you do that. It was just the knowledge that hey, stuff happens and there's nothing you can do about it.
Right, and it's a natural consequence of knowledge. There's not any kind of ascetic exercises we're supposed to go through. Whatever therapy there is in Spinoza's ethics is an epistemic one, a rational, intellectual one.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Stoic part is a little bit Buddhist in a way, but I agree that doesn't mean that he's mystical in the common sense of that term.
I've heard people say that Spinoza, when I describe Spinoza's views, I hear people say that it sounds very much like Buddhism. I know practically nothing about Buddhism, so I can't say, but I think there might be interesting comparisons to be made there.
Well, there is the Stoic part. I mean, Buddhism is more Stoic than people realize. The idea is that you're supposed to be able to deal with any circumstance whatsoever, and even in a certain sense, just get over this whole aversion thing, right? I mean, things that seem unpleasant. The problem is, the problem is just that you feel averse toward them. Quit doing that, and then everything will be okay. So it is very Stoic.
Although the interesting twist in Spinoza is that whether in his absolutely deterministic system, you don't have that kind of control, spontaneous control over whether you are averse to something or not. You have to, in a way, figure out the causal mechanisms. And the more you come to understand something, what you learn from the ethics is that your goal is to pursue knowledge. And the natural result of that knowledge will be a lessening of, or weakening of your passionate reactions to things. It's not as if in a Spinozistic system I can say, okay, you know what, I'm just not going to care about that so much anymore. It's not, you don't have that spontaneous libertarian type of freedom.
Well, how does it work, though, that just sheer comprehension, intellectual comprehension, helps you overcome your passions? Just because you realize they are irrational?
He does say that all of our passions, which are rational, what he calls our inadequate ideas, the ways in which we respond to things, they can be transformed into knowledge by looking at the bigger picture, by understanding essentially parts 1 and 2 of the ethics, how we are a part of nature, and that there are these different aspects of nature, each of which is governed by laws or processes. And he thinks it's not as if that from that we learn to control our emotions, but rather the acquisition of that knowledge naturally leads to a weakening of the passions. It's all
I
a
see.
very causal process.
So the exercise of your rational faculties makes them stronger relative to
Exactly.
your passions.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. The reason I ask about a spiritual discipline is because in Buddhism, of course, there is such a thing. I mean, the idea is that the two big problems are you're averse to some things and you thirst for others and try to cling to them. And meditation is a discipline for kind of disempowering both of those reactions. But okay, so it sounds like a lot of what you're saying in your kind of embrace of Spinoza as somebody who's right for the times is that he was a kind of a paragon of modern liberal values, Enlightenment values, having to do with freedom of expression, scientific inquiry, and so on, right?
Yes. I think to that extent, Jonathan Israel's recent work on radical enlightenment. While I don't agree with everything that Jonathan says, I don't think all of the radical enlightenment can be traced back to Spinoza. I think it's important to incorporate Spinoza into our understanding of the origins of Enlightenment thinking.
Huh. Where does he, on the chronological spectrum, is he kind of at the very beginning of what yeah, he is. So because he's like late 17th, early 18th century. And
Who, Spinoza?
yeah.
Oh, he's dead by 1677.
Okay, so so he's very early.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is hard-pressed to find, unless you want to think of Descartes as an early Enlightenment thinker, you'd be hard-pressed to find much Enlightenment-type thought before Spinoza.
Okay.
I mean, of course, you have figures like Erasmus and others, Montaigne, who sort of set the stage for this kind of thought. But, I mean, to take the Enlightenment back to the middle of the 17th century, that's probably as early as you want to go.
Yeah.
And still call it Enlightenment with a capital E.
Yeah, and even there, I mean, many of the figures who come to mind are actually mid-late 18th century, just when you hear the word Enlightenment.
Right. And I think that, the importance of Spinoza is that we have to go before. It's not, the Enlightenment doesn't begin with Voltaire and Diderot and Rousseau. It has its roots, and I think this is an important consequence of Jonathan Israel's work. It has its roots in not just in the moderate thought of people like Locke, but also in a much more radical stream in people like Spinoza.
Yeah. Locke is more commonly thought of as the person you're describing Spinoza as in terms of liberal values, but I gather if you really look at Locke's letter of toleration, there are limits to his toleration that might have been narrower than Spinoza's, right?
Oh, quite a bit. I mean, Locke says there'll be no room in my state, as he imagines the tolerant liberal state. There's still no place in it for Catholics or atheists.
Uh-huh. Which would mean Spinoza, I guess.
Right.
No room for Spinoza. And does Jonathan Israel, is he able to draw connections in terms of Enlightenment thinkers actually having read Spinoza, or is it more conjectural than that?
It's both. I mean, he draws some very clear lines of people who commented on Spinoza's works and were explicitly inspired by it. And at the same time, as intellectual history proceeds, there are affinities that he finds between later thinkers who don't necessarily cite Spinoza.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So anything else you want to say about why he's kind of right for our time, or anything else you want to say in praise or, for that matter, in condemnation of him?
Well, I do think that he had a particularly clear-eyed view about what it is to be a flourishing human being, what it is to live a good life. Mm-hmm. And I think we'd all be better off taking our lessons from him. I think he was an extremely wise individual and probably very charismatic as well. And, it's a shame to see that so many of his lessons still go unheeded.
Okay. Well, I'll sign on to the Spinoza fan club. And I guess if people are interested in him, you've written more than one book that's relevant, right? You wrote a biography of Spinoza.
Yep. I wrote a biography called Spinoza, A Life. I have a book that's a sort of introductory overview or analysis of the ethics. Mm-hmm. I have a book called A Book Forged in Hell, Spinoza's Scandalous Treatise and the Birth of the Secular Age, which is about the theological political treatise.
Okay, and then what are your most recent books? You've got a recent book about Descartes, or?
Yeah, The Philosopher, the Priest, and the Painter it's a study. It's not a full biography of Descartes, but it's a little portrait of Descartes which addresses his. Well, it takes as a starting point this portrait of Descartes that the Dutch painter Frans Hals made,
Hmm.
and it uses that as a way of stepping into Descartes' life in the Netherlands at the time.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Stephen. And
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
okay, take care.